All right, everyone. We are going to get started now. And let's go back to the very first. Come on, there we go. Okay, there we go. Perfect. Now I'm going to hide the interface. It's not working. All right, well, whatever, we'll just have to do. Okay, so we are going to be talking about expelling a people, and this is a continuation of our ongoing series, Controversial Halacha. And you can see on the screen in front of you that both of those points are being made on the screen. All right, so let's get talking, let's get schmoozing. During the 1980s, there was a very well-known rabbinic figure in the American Jewish community who later moved to Israel, who aggressively argued at many public venues that halacha requires that the state of Israel expel all of its Arab residents. Now, this individual, some of you might know his name, but this individual got himself into some pretty hot water for many of these sorts of comments. He was actually deemed to be something of a racist in the media, which is probably no, I won't make a comment on that. But he was a very well-known rabbinic figure. He was known mostly as a community organizer. He was not recognized as being a halachic decider. For example, nobody came over to him and asked him about whether or not this Sefer Torah is a kosher Sefer Torah or is it an invalid Sefer Torah. That's just never the sort of question that he would ever be asked. So he wasn't known for being a posek or a halachic authority of any significant stature. But he was a recognized community leader, and he definitely was able to stir the pot quite a bit. And he actually seemed to have, at least in this instance, when he argued that there is a halachic imperative to expel all Arab residents of Israel, he seemed to have something on his side, or something that would be rather difficult to disprove. And that is the Rambam, Maimonides. Let's take a look at the language that's employed. You should have it on the screen in front of you. For those of us here, it's on the screen that's being projected. I have it on my computer screen. And this is what the Rambam says. Bizman sheyad Yisrael takifa aleihem, asur lanu lahaniach ovdei chachavim beinenu. The Rambam is saying, when we have sovereignty, when we have agency, when we have the ability to control our own destiny, as it were, and we are living in the land of Israel, we are forbidden from allowing non-Jews, idolaters specifically, in our midst. They're not allowed to live in the land of Israel. Afilu Yoshev Yeshivas Arai, even if they're only a temporary visitor to the land of Israel. O over mimokum lamokum baschora, or if they're not even residing in the land of Israel, they're just making a stop. It's point B on their travel to point C. Lo yavor ba'artzenu ela ad sheyakabel alav sheva mitzvos shenitztavu b'nei Noach. There seems to be, according to the Rambam, a prohibition against allowing them into our land unless they have accepted upon themselves the 7 Noahide commandments. How do we know this? Well, Shenemar, it says, this is the book of Exodus, talking about how the Jewish people will come and they'll conquer the land. Lo yeshvu ba'artzecha, you will not allow those non-Jewish people, those heathens, those idol worshippers into your land. Afilu lefi sha'ah, even for just a moment. V'im kibel alav sheva mitzvos, if a non-Jew, however, accepts upon themselves the 7 Noahide commandments, let me just allow this person in. If we allow them if they are prepared to take upon themselves these 7 commandments that are known, then they would be counted as a ger tosha. That is a legal category. A non-Jew who has accepted upon themselves the 7 commandments that we believe are incumbent upon all peoples of the world, then that individual will be allowed entry into the land of Israel. We'll give him leave to live there. However, the Rambam writes, Ein mekablin ger toshav ela bizman shehayovel noheg. The problem is, according to the Rambam, we don't give anybody this category unless we're able to receive them in a Beis Din. But a Beis Din will not see this individual through to this category of being called a ger toshav only at the time when the Yovel, when the 50-year cycle was in effect. However, he says, now that it's not in effect, the only thing that Beis Din will do will be to convert individuals, but we do not the Rambam writes, accept someone as a ger toshav. Ger toshav, it seems to be, according to the Rambam, was more than just an individual taking upon themselves the obligatory 7 commandments. Rather, it was a legal category that was bestowed upon them by a Jewish court. And only after that time, the individual should, according to the Rambam anyways, be allowed entry into Israel. Now, this seems to be fairly conclusive, and this is what that individual drew upon when he said, we have such a prohibition. Non-Jews are not allowed in Israel. We should be expelling all the Arabs. That's what this individual said. But in this class, we're going to present 2 different opinions from 2 different halachic authorities, one being Rav Yitzchak Herzog, who we spoke about in the past. He was one of the last rabbi of the British Mandate Palestine, and he was the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of the state of Israel. He started off his life born in Poland. He grew up in London. He became the chief rabbi of Ireland, and in the early 1940s, he made Aliyah, and he became a rabbinic personality in Israel. This is Rav Yitzchak Herzog. He wrote extensively on this topic, as well as Rabbi Yehuda Amital, another individual we've spoken about in the past. He was the individual who was largely responsible for the Hesder yeshivos, the idea that you can study in yeshiva and serve in the military. And that can be institutionalized within the structure of both the military and a yeshiva. They both issue rulings on this, and they both strongly disagree with this halachic pronouncement from this individual. They disagree and say that perhaps not only are we not obligated to expel people from the land of Israel, it might even be forbidden. And we'll discuss that momentarily. But before we do that, let's get into the discussion here about who are the individuals that we're dealing with. Who are we discussing? We're talking about the Jewish people who live in Israel. I'm sure you've heard stories in the news about a particular subsect of Orthodox Jews who like to protest against the state of Israel, who like to join the pro-Palestinian protests, usually in places like New York and in Israel, and sometimes they even go to Iran and end up making out with the president or prime minister. I'm not sure what their system of government is. They actually do have a source themselves also. They look at the following Gemara. When they say that we may not conquer the land of Israel ourselves, they're actually looking at this statement from the Talmud. This is from Ksuvos, Kuf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph. It says here that there were 3 oaths that Hashem forced on, 2 on the Jewish people, 1 on the surrounding nations. Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Chanina, said, what are these 3 oaths that are mentioned in the Song of Songs and Shir HaShirim? Why were they needed? 1, so that the Jews should not ascend Eretz Yisrael as a wall, which means they may not enter Israel as a large group of people. They may only enter little by little until Mashiach comes. Another oath Hashem forced was that the Jews should not rebel against the nations of the world. That was the 2nd oath. And the last one, that Hashem forced on the nations of the world that they should not subjugate the Jews excessively. This is what the Talmud says, and this is what the Satmar Rebbe relied on when he said that it is forbidden to get into any kind of military occupation of the land of Israel, at least, Jews occupying the land. That would be outright forbidden. They would say, absolutely, this Gemara would completely preclude any Jewish government forcing out, expelling the non-Jewish population of Israel, because this would be a direct contradiction or directly in a direct transgression against this oath that we made that was essentially put into place to ensure that we do not conquer Israel by force. And so definitely within that group of people, that subsect of the Orthodox Jewish population, they would say, yes, we have a source here that says you may not kick out non-Jews, whether they're Arab or otherwise, from the land of Israel, and it comes from this Gemara. Now, this is a source that is relied upon by the Neturei Karta and other such disposed individuals, but I'm actually not going to talk about them. I'm going to talk about the more liberal and religious Zionist community, and show that within the rubric, within their halachic system, they also are much the same mind that we may not expel non-Jews from the land of Israel. And again, the 2 sources that we're going to be discussing are Rav Herzog and Rav Amital. So let's talk about Rav Herzog. Here you go. This is the introduction. Rav Herzog relies on a halachic decision that was made by Rav Kook that also ties in the idea that Muslims are de facto gerei toshav. If you recall, we looked at the Rambam, we looked at Maimonides, who said that you have to kick out everyone who's not Jewish unless they're considered a ger toshav. They're a non-Jew who has taken upon themselves the Sheva Mitzvos B'nai Noach, the 7 Noahide commandments. We're going to perhaps show that this is a justification for not expelling them. So let's go. So Rav Herzog was very passionately devoted to the goal of operating a modern state of Israel in accordance with international law as well as halacha. And what's really most fascinating is that he wrote his manuscript, his sefer, on this topic called Techuka Liyisrael Al Pi HaTorah, and it grapples with all the issues that we are still struggling with to this very day, where he tries to discuss how it's possible to administer a modern state within a halachic system. He was asking these questions well before the state of Israel even existed. He wrote this in the early 1940s, well before the United Nations vote to establish the state of Israel in 1947. So you can see just how much forethought he had put into some of these questions, because he addresses this issue specifically. What do we do with the pre-existing inhabitants of the land of Israel? This individual in. All right. So that is the question at hand. And so one of the issues that he grapples with, as I mentioned, was this fact that the United Nations would vote to establish the state of Israel. He essentially said that we're going to rely on the United Nations in order for the state of Israel to exist, and we're definitely going to have to rely on the good graces of the international community for its continued endurance. The international community nor the United Nations would never vote to establish the state of Israel if they refuse to grant some sort of religious freedom to all of its residents, including people who are not Jewish. We would never be able to have the international support that would have been necessary to establish the state of Israel. This requirement seems to contradict the Rambam, as we said. Essentially, what he's asking, we cannot establish a state of Israel without granting some kind of system for religious freedoms in our country. And at the same time, we have this Rambam that seems to say we're not allowed to allow non-Jews to live in Israel. So what does the Rav Herzog do? Well, he quotes from two other sources here. Before we get into the more nitty-gritty details, he basically says the Rambam is not the final word. The Rambam had his own system of deriving halacha, but there are many other medieval rabbis and subsequent rabbis who had a lot more to say about halacha, and the halacha does not always follow the opinion of the Rambam. So, for example, you should have on the page in front of you, on the left-hand side, the Ravid. This is Rabbeinu Avram of Post Squares. He was about a generation or two after the Rambam. He lived in Provence. He was the primary, what would I call him? Opponent to the Rambam, and he wrote a stricture to the Mishnah Torah where he basically took every opportunity to disagree that he could. That's just what he did. Take a look at his language over here. He quotes the Rambam that we just read, where he says that you're not allowed to allow non-Jews into the land of Israel, even if it's only for a temporary residence, even if they're just passing through the land. Is Omar Avram, that's what this Aleph means. Zos lo matzanu v'lo shamanu me'olam. I never heard such a halacha ever being promulgated. It's not found in the Gemara. It's not found in the Midrashim. I've never heard this halachic pronouncement from anyone other than Maimonides, the Ravid writes. V'hapasuk shehu mevi, and that verse that the Rambam relies on when he said we're not allowed to grant leave for any residence for anyone who's not a ger toshav, a Noahide, or a Jew, that verse is not talking about all nations. It's only talking about the Zayin Umos. It's spelled with an Aleph, whatever. It's only talking about the 7 Canaanite nations that we were obligated to completely dispossess of the land. So that idea that we're not allowed to grant any kind of leave was not about all non-Jews. It was only about those 7 Canaanite peoples. And he basically says that, He says, and furthermore, that's about residing. There's no problem with allowing a Canaanite to walk through the land of Israel. Is basically what he says over here at the end. But the thrust of this Ravid is that he actually disagreed with the Rambam. And Rav Kook said, in matters of duress, and the only halachic authority that you have is the Rambam, and he's being opposed by the Ravid. Well, then we can actually decide the halacha, not like the Rambam, like the Ravid, in circumstances and situations of necessity. Now, that's one answer that we could give to the Rambam, but it just essentially says there's no prohibition against having non-Jews live in the land of Israel. The other important item that we have to take note of, which is another commentary to the Rambam, it's the Kesef Mishnah. This was written by Rabbi Yosef Cairo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, and he writes as follows. He basically he takes a different tack with regards to the Rambam. V'ladas Rabbeinu, according to Maimonides, according to the Rambam, Nira Lomer, it would appear de'ein hochinami sheme'atzmo kibalav sheva mitzvos she'ein mone'in oso mishivas haaretz. If someone were to somehow take it upon themselves the 7 Noahide commandments, and they could finagle it in such a way that that would be considered a valid acceptance, then there's no reason or no ability that we have to stop someone from living in the land of Israel if they're not Jewish. The only thing the Rambam, the only thing Maimonides means to say is that the Beth Din does not function in such a way as to accept such an individual as a ger toshav, but should someone be able to finagle such a way to accept it upon himself and have that be viewed as valid, then there's no reason we would have to preclude their residence in the land of Israel. So this idea, we take a step further now. And this is what Rav Kook does. And we have to know that Rav Kook here was not talking about allowing non-Jews to live in the land of Israel. Rather, what he's talking about is selling land to non-Jews in regards to solving Shemitah issues. You know, every 7 years, you can't harvest the ground. You can't harvest your crops. It made a real problem for the agricultural settlements. And so Rav Kook was trying to find a solution. So he said, just sell the land to a non-Jew. How are you allowed to sell it to a non-Jew? The Rambam says they're not allowed to even live there. How can you sell the property to them? So this is what Rav Kook says. Rav Kook argues, again, as we said before, that in cases of great need, we can rely on the halachic opinion of the Ravid. But he also regarded Muslims as essentially adhering to the 7 Noahide laws. And this is especially true due to the fact that they are strict monotheists. Rav Kook, as mentioned, issued this ruling, and he said that Muslims are a population that are, by their nature, a Noahide law-abiding bunch. And as such, we can sell them the land, and for our purposes, we can allow them to reside in the land. And not only that, he said the Rambam was of the opinion that you need to have a Beis Din to confer this title of ger toshav in order to allow them to remain. Rav Kook goes a step, speaks to that. He quotes Nachmanides, the Ramban, who held that the only reason why the Beis Din needs to be involved is in order to ensure that the commitment is taken seriously and that this individual is not just spouting hot air. They really do intend to keep the 7 Noahide laws. Now, when it comes to the Muslim community, they have an entire community that has a whole religious system predicated on the Noahide laws. Maybe it's not the Noahide laws as we know them, as we understand them, but as part of the Quran, as part of their religious observances, they're maintaining all 7 commandments of the B'nai Noach. And he says they do not need a Beis Din to confer the title of ger toshav on them because they have a society that keeps each other in check. The entire society is based on these principles. They have a whole religious infrastructure that they all sort of are a party to. They are de facto ger toshav. They require no Beis Din to confer this title upon them. That is Rav Kook's opinion. As such, the Rambam says we have to expel all non-Jews except those who are Noahides, those who have accepted the Sheva Mitzvos B'nai Noach. The Rav Herzog, relying on Rav Kook's decision, came to the conclusion that Muslims are not subject to this because they are already considered to be within the category of a ger toshav. this individual who has taken upon himself to keep all 7 commandments. Now we have to note, we should take under advisement that Rav Kook's opinion was not universal. There were people who disagreed with him, this de facto ger toshav status. Someone who lived in a generation or two later, the Chazon Ish, who was a primary student, or he carried on he was a flag bearer for Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, who represent the Eida Haredis, the Hungarian community that really stood in stark opposition to Rav Kook. He actually said that's not what a ger toshav is. A ger toshav has to go to a basin because they have to acknowledge the Torah, the special relationship that God has with the Jewish people, how the Jewish people were given the Torah, and as part of that religious structure, the Sheva Mitzvos have to be observed. So there's a certain sort of tipping of the hat that must be made to the Jewish religion in order for someone to have the category of ger toshav, and thus the Chazon Ish strongly disagreed with Rav Kook. But we're going to take Rav Kook as the final word here. A Muslim is considered to be a ger toshav. He's considered to be an individual who is bound to keep the Sheva Mitzvos B'nai Noach, the 7 Noahide commandments. Now, that only helps us as far as Muslims go. And Rav Herzog then has to address the issue of other religions. Let's talk about Christianity, for example. Christians live in Israel. Muslims and Jews, who at least at that time and still probably to this day are the predominant majority of non-Jews who live in Israel, and they're all strict monotheists. But there are other groups of non-Jews who live in Israel. We do have Christians, and even more recently, we've had a quite an influx of migrants from Africa who are Christian animists. Some of them are Muslim, but some of them are outright polytheists. What do we do about them? How do we handle that? Well, Islam is considered to be a form of, monotheism that we can tolerate. Let's say, what do we do with the obligation to completely outlaw and expel idolatry from the land of Israel? So the first thing we have to discuss, perhaps, is Christianity considered to be idolatry to begin with? There is a Meiri, Rabbeinu Avram Meimont Pilier. He's known in Hebrew as Rabbeinu Avram Min Hahar. He was a halachic authority. He lived in about 14th century Provence. He was of the opinion that Christianity does constitute a form of monotheism. The problem with that opinion, with the Meiri's opinion, is that does not seem to be the halachic consensus. Most halachic authorities, like the Noda B'Yehuda, which is Rabbi Cheskel Landau, and others, are of the opinion that Christianity is a form of idolatry. How so? Well, because Christianity takes the idea of a single God and divides that God into 3 personalities. In essence, besides for the God that we worship, there's also a Son and a Holy Ghost. So that perhaps for some people can quibble on this point. Is this considered to be idolatry? Is it not considered to be idolatry? Definitely everybody agrees that a Jew is not allowed to believe that. The argument is, are non-Jews subject to the same prohibition? Most halachic authorities believe that Christianity constitutes a form of avodah zarah or idolatry. And this has become a greater problem with let's put Christianity to the side. What do we do with all these animists and all these other polytheists who are entering the land of Israel now? Are we obligated to expel them? Are we obligated to kick them out? What do we do about everybody else who's not a Muslim? So this is what Rav Herzog writes. Let's take a look. He notes that the application of this halacha has to take into consideration the current state not only of the Jewish people, but as well as the Jewish nation, the state of Israel also. This is the language. This is. Go ahead.
Sorry, what year was this again?
So this was written in the sort of the early to mid 1940s, before the state of Israel was right. But when the halachic authorities were sort of still talking about how do you have a halachically governed Jewish state in Israel?
It's still during World War II.
It's still during World War II. Right. That just tells you how. Excuse me. How much forethought Rav Herzog had. He was writing about this even before the state of Israel existed. This is what he writes. We will receive the Jewish state through the consent of nations, of the United Nations, and there's no doubt that until the arrival of Mashiach, we shall depend on them, not necessarily the United Nations, but on the goodwill of the international community for protection against a sea of surrounding enemies. What can we do? Tell the nations of the world we cannot accept this condition, that all non-Jews be permitted to the land of Israel, enjoy the freedom to practice their polytheistic or semi-polytheistic religions because the Torah forbids us? Can we go and tell that to the nations whose goodwill we rely in order to ensure that the state of Israel continues and endures? I believe that there's not one rabbi in the Jewish people who is intelligent and has common sense who believes that we should respond accordingly. Even if one assumes that by accepting this condition, the Jewish state will exist in a state of sin, I would say that this sin is condoned due to pikuach nefesh, danger to life. Essentially, what he's saying is that we have a whole bunch of Jews living in the state of Israel, and we rely on the goodwill of nations in order for us to continue to operate as a country. If we were to reject religious freedom in our country, we put Jewish lives at risk. And even though this might be a sin, well, a sin is okay. We're allowed to sin if it means that this might save a Jewish life. Thank you very much. Greatly appreciated. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehakol niheh b'dvarav.
Amen.
It's very possible to say that this will create danger for the entire Jewish people. So, in essence, Rabbi Herzog is noting the obligation to eliminate idolatry from Eretz Yisrael, and he's also speaking to the fact that that obligation came in the times of Joshua, Yehoshua, when they were conquering Israel from the 7 Canaanite nations. We did not depend on the approval of anyone else in order to establish our own kingdom at that time. Rav Herzog believes that in the current circumstances, the situation in which Israel exists now, that mitzvah just cannot apply. Just as it doesn't apply to Jews who live outside of the state of Israel, right? Outside the land of Israel, we have no obligation to go and burn down churches and destroy and defile Buddhist temples and Hindu shrines. There's no such obligation that we have. In the state of Israel, also, he's saying, in the land of Israel, the obligation to do so would only be if we have complete and absolute control and we're absolutely secure in our ability to take care of ourselves. But being that Jewish sovereignty now requires the consent of the nations of the world, you can't operate that way. And if we do operate that way, Jewish lives will be at risk.
So essentially saying you don't need the condition of the Rambam's first.
Exactly.
The 3 words.
Yes, exactly. That is exactly the point. He says the Yad Yisrael Takifa is not applicable nowadays. So therefore, Rav Herzog concludes that the Jewish state that started in 1947 was created in partnership, not just amongst Jews, but also the non-Jewish residents of the land and the United Nations. And this could hardly be compared to the kingdoms of David HaMelech and Shlomo, in which we were the complete masters of our own fate. We were completely empowered to remove Avodah Zarah from our midst, and by and large, we did. Rav Herzog argues that it is permissible to enter into such a partnership for the benefit of our nation. Remember when he was writing this? He was writing this in the mid-1940s. So he was very full aware of the Holocaust. And he's essentially saying, we need this land because we have a whole bunch of really hurt, damaged people who need some place to go. And we also, to a certain extent, need to be able to provide our own protection, hence the land of Israel. He says this was a sort of symbiotic partnership that the Jewish people established in the Second Temple period when they formed an alliance with the Persian Empire, Cyrus allowing us to go and rebuild the Second Temple. This allowed us to achieve our foothold in Eretz Yisrael. We're allowed to make such compromises in order to establish a place for Jews to go and live. We're allowed to act in partnership with the international community. And even this, if this might mean that, we're going to have to break this law anyways, pikuach nefesh, the obligation to save Jewish lives, overwhelms and overrules other considerations. So according to Rav Herzog, there is no obligation to expel whether they are monotheist or polytheist, non-Jewish inhabitants, non-Jewish residents from the land of Israel. We're now going to take this a step further, the Rav Amital's additional comment, and this is predicated on some of the things we've been discussing in previous week's classes. Rav Herzog's approach was obviously accepted by the overwhelming majority of observant Jews, because not only did the religious Zionist rabbis and representatives signed Israel's Declaration of Independence that granted freedom of religion to all inhabitants. But even the more Haredi signatories also signed the same document. There were representatives of the Agudas Yisrael who were there present. They obviously agreed with Rabbi Herzog's assertion that this is something that we can tolerate and perhaps even should tolerate in order to establish the state of Israel. There's no obligation that we have to expel and kick these people out. That would subject the Jewish people to great risk. Rav Amital writes that once this agreement was made, once the Declaration of Independence was signed, it became a covenantal agreement. This was a treaty. And here you have the title of the next discussion over here. Rav Amital argues that Israel's Declaration of Independence has its own halachic imperative with it as well. What is that halachic imperative? Let's take a look at what the Rambam writes. The Rambam writes, if the Jewish king or a Jewish kingdom, or any Jew for that matter, enters into some kind of a treaty, some kind of a covenant, some kind of legally binding relationship, the osur l'shakir bivrisam ulechazev lohem achar shehishlimu v'kiblu sheva mitzvos. It is forbidden to lie when making a treaty within the forbidden for a Jewish nation to break that treaty, to be unfaithful to them, assuming the other party has accepted upon himself the Sheva Mitzvos B'nai Noach. We'll get to that in a second. But you right away have the Radvaz, who's another sort of commentator on the page, who says, where do we know this from? Where do we know that Jews are obligated to keep their treaties, their national treaties, even if those treaties transgress Torah principles and commandments? We know this from Joshua and the Givonim. If you recall, Joshua was given the mandate to expel the 7 Canaanite people and conquer the territory for the Jewish people. And the Givonim were a Canaanite people, but they disguised themselves as someone else. And they came to Yehoshua and said, hey, we're non-Jews from a really faraway place, but we really love you Jews. We'd like to sign a peace treaty with you so that you will never attack us and we will never attack you. And Joshua said, sure. And they signed this document. All of a sudden they rip off their kaftans, and you see that they are wearing short coats after all. They're litvaks. They are Canaanim, and the Jewish people were bound by that treaty. The Givonim were allowed to remain in the land of Israel amongst all the 7 Canaanite peoples. And the reason why is because Yehoshua signed that treaty. We are bound to the treaties that we sign. To break them would be, as the Radvaz says, a chilul Hashem, a desecration of God's name, that we're unfaithful to the words that we say. So that Declaration of Independence, Rav Amital writes, is a form of legally binding relationship with the international community, also with the inhabitants of the land who were discussed, and that we create. I'm not sure exactly how, if non-Jews signed the Declaration of Independence, but despite that, we entered into a legally binding commitment that's written on a piece of paper that exists as a treaty or a Declaration of Independence in this case. As such, Rav Amital argues, even if there's no danger, right? Rav Herzog's whole permission was predicated on the danger discussion. Or if we would be in danger if we were to expel them. Rav Amital says that even if we were not in danger, we would be forbidden, we would be halachically held to the treaty that we signed, the Declaration of Independence that promises religious freedom, even freedom to worship, which means that not only are non-Jews allowed to live there, they're also allowed to open up their houses of worship as well. So the Rambam's requirement that those who we've made a treaty accept the 7 Noahide laws seems to be true, and Rav Amital would very often discuss and speak to the fact, especially he was actually talking about commanding officers. In the Israeli military, there were commanding officers who were not Jewish. How is it that we're allowed to have these people in positions of authority over the Jews? Well, he would basically argue that non-Jews nowadays, by and large, do keep the Sheva Mitzvos B'nai Noach. They do keep the 7 Noahide laws. That's our default assumption. As such, we have to assume that anyone who's living in the land of Israel, we're bound to the treaty that we have signed with them. So thus, even if one argues that the situation has now changed and we now have Yad Yisrael Takifa, as the Rambam says, we now have that full sovereignty and ability to act on our own, we cannot change our policy due to the consideration of a Chil Hashem. And furthermore, paraphrasing Rav Herzog that we saw earlier, I kind of believe that there's not a single rabbi in Israel who's intelligent, who has common sense, who would think that Israel is not dependent on the goodwill of nations. Goodwill of its partners, such as the United States, that provides a considerable amount of funds and military aid. That to kick out all non-Jews would really sully that relationship. The state of Israel is in absolute danger if we were to act this way. So as such, we do not have the authority to kick them out. We don't have the ability to kick them out. And as Rabbi Ovadia Yosef himself writes, we're currently unable to remove Avodah Zarah and its worshippers from the land of Israel. And similarly, other Israeli halachic authorities have weighed in on this topic. Rav Yaron Zilberstein writes that regarding these non-Jews who serve as loyal soldiers in the IDF, rejecting them either socially or economically will push them into the open arms of our enemies and will impinge on the military viability of the state of Israel. So in conclusion to this part of the class anyways, the aforementioned rabbinic figure who argued that halacha demands that Israel expel all of its non-Jewish inhabitants is both unreasonable, unfounded, and perhaps outright forbidden by the halachic structure in which he operates. Now, this does not remove the option of kicking people out who pose a risk to the state of Israel. I mean, things like, suicide bombers and those who launch launch missiles at innocent civilians. Those bad eggs can definitely be kicked out on their ear. But as a overall policy, we're under no halachic obligation and perhaps even forbidden from expelling all non-Jews from the land of Israel. But let's talk about part B. Let's discuss kicking Jews out, which has in fact happened. Gush Katif in 2005 was a group of kibbutzim right by the Gaza Strip. And in 2005, about 8,000 inhabitants were removed from these settlements, effectively ending Jewish habitation of that region, of that area. It was a very traumatic event for the state of Israel. And the intention was to improve the security and stability of Medinas Israel. The destruction of these highly productive Jewish communities was absolutely a tragedy, even if one believes that it was essential in order to ensure Israel's secure future. There was a highly significant article that appeared at that time, written by the then chief Ashkenazic rabbi of Israel, Rav Yonah Metzger, discussing whether or not we should institute a fast day on the day that the Gush Katif was destroyed. It was dismantled, and the settlers sort of dispossessed of their property. He asked this as a question: should this tragic occasion be marked as a fast day, even with its own kinos, elegies, mournful prayers mourning the destruction of Jewish communities? And he gives 3 reasons why not. So he argues, if you were to open up the Shulchan Aruch, you would see that the Shulchan Aruch, written by Rabbi Yosef Karo, lists no less than 21 days that are appropriate fast days appropriate for fasting, due to the various, mishaps and tragedies that occurred on all of those days. For example, Nadav and Avihu died on the 1st of Nisan, so therefore perhaps it's appropriate to fast on the 1st of Nisan. Aharon a Kohen died on the 1st of the month of Av. The 23rd of Shvat marked the beginning of the civil war that is recounted at the end of the book of Shoftim, the book of Judges, between the majority of the Jewish tribes and the tribe of Binyamin. Perhaps we should be mourning the day that Gush Katif was destroyed as well. Maybe we should add this day to our calendar. The reason why we don't is predicated on this Aruch HaShulchan that you have on the screen right in front of you. What does the Aruch HaShulchan say? The Aruch HaShulchan says, Ach ata bizmanenu b'medinosenu lo shamanu mishum yis'ana b'ta'anisim elu sheyisbaer. However, in our days, and especially in all the places where Jews happen to live, I've never heard of anyone who fasts on those days enumerated by the Shulchan Aruch. And he gives two arguments why perhaps there's no halachic thrust, there's no halachic obligation to fast on those days. He says the only source that we have for fasting on those days comes to us from the Gaonim, the first generation of post-Talmudic rabbis. And if you take a look at their writings, they never actually say one is obligated to fast on those days. They never say that it's a gzeira. They never say that it is an edict. The most they ever say is it's an appropriate thing to do. Perhaps it's a nice thing, it's a good thing. It's like kissing your bubby. It's a nice thing to do, but there's no mitzvah. And as such, he says there's no halachic thrust. He also quotes the Rush here. Rabbi Usher ben Yechiel, who was a Ashkenazi Rav who lived in Spain during the 1300s. He also says that there's no authority in the post-Talmudic period to promulgate decrees that are incumbent upon the entirety of the Jewish people. He says there's no authority to do so. So accordingly, this is what Rav Metzger writes. He says that if these 21 days that are enumerated in the Shulchan Aruch are not observed, it makes little sense for us to add an additional day to mark the Churban, the destruction of Gush Katif. And it may be possible to just add Gush Katif into the framework of Tisha B'Av, which is a very important idea. The reason why all these fasts, perhaps, and this is just a supposition on my part, perhaps the reason why we don't fast on all 21 of these days mentioned, the 20 days mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch, there's an additional day that the Magen Avram adds, that's why I keep saying 21. The Shulchan Aruch only says 20. So the reason why we don't fast on all those days is because those are all days that mark some unfortunate event that took place because of our exile. Being stuck in Europe during the Crusades, being stuck in North Africa and Europe and the Middle East during the Black Death. These are all traumatic, horrible events that were all incredibly disruptive and destructive at the same time, and they primarily affected us because we're in a state of exile. We can't be fasting for every single bad thing that happened to us during the exile, because a lot of bad things have happened for us over the course of the exile. We'd be fasting every single day. So we make sure to fast over the course of 4 times during the year, these 4 times marking the exile, the most intense day being Tisha B'Av. The Tisha B'Av is one of 4 fast days that mark the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash and the exile that came as a consequence of this. So if Tisha B'Av is the day where we're most intently focused on the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, then perhaps the Gush Katif, like all these other unfortunate experiences that we've had that have been about because of the unfortunate experiences that we have having to deal with anti-Semitism and in this exile, are all incorporated into those fast days. So perhaps he says we can incorporate Gush Katif into a form of mourning on Tisha B'Av, using Tisha B'Av to mourn not only the destruction of the temple, but again, subsequent tragedies, travesties, including the destruction of these Jewish communities. That's reason number 1. The first reason being is that there isn't nobody fasts on these days. There's no halachic obligation to fast on these days. And perhaps the reason why there's no halachic obligation to fast on these days is because we're already marking the exile in the fast days that we already have, and observing it on Tisha B'Av and not creating a new day to fast for Gush Katif. Reason number 2. The reason number 2 is from Rav Moshe Feinstein. Rav Moshe Feinstein's halachic decision when it came to mourning for the Holocaust. Rav Moshe Feinstein writes that he was opposed to the establishing a new fast day for the Holocaust. Rav Moshe rejected this suggestion, citing the precedent of the absence of new days of fasting for the enormous suffering that we endured during the Crusades. He notes that Ashkenazi Jews during the Crusades did not add a new fast day. Instead, they just authored kinos, elegies, mournful prayer poems that we recite on Tisha B'Av that marks those occasions. We did not add fast days. And similarly, he adds, the Sfardisha community, they did not add special days for fasting for the Inquisition and the expulsion. They just added kinos for Tisha B'Av that were recited on Tisha B'Av. So he writes that we have to view the Holocaust as part of the many tragedies that we've endured during this long exile, similar to what we said just a moment ago. And indeed, as I said just a moment ago also, The perceived need for the withdrawal from Gush Katif was entirely due to the relentless intolerance of, our Arab neighbors who reject the sovereignty that we have over the land of Israel, which is another expression of this exile that we continue to endure. We might be living in Israel, but we're still in exile. So, as such, according to Moshe Feinstein, we lack the halachic precedent to add new fast days. We don't see that it has been done. So, while we said before, the reason perhaps why we don't is because we already have fast days that incorporate the troubles and tribulation of the Jewish history. Moshe Feinstein adds an additional reason is that we just don't have any form of jurisprudence. We have no precedent. We have no template. This was not done where the entirety of the Jewish people took upon themselves another fast day. You do find local communities who have taken on fast days, but those are very localized. They're very regional. Like the Magen Avram writes that the Jews of Eastern Europe used to fast on the 20th of Sivan, I believe it was, for the Chmielnitsky massacres of 1641 and 1642. But those were very localized. They were not adopted by the entirety of the Jewish people. Now, there are some halakhic authorities who do accept Yom HaShoah, the day of the Holocaust, and perhaps it should be marked with mourning, so on and so forth. Rav Metzger writes, you can say that about the Holocaust. You can't say that about Gush Katif. The horrors of the Holocaust were so incredibly severe, so incredibly extreme. We cannot compare the unfortunate experience of these 8,000 people being dispossessed of their property with 6 million people being butchered. There's just no comparison, he says. So even those halachic authorities who say perhaps we can create a new day, Yom HaShoah, it would just perhaps even be insulting to the victims of the Holocaust to mark the Gush Katif tragedy with the same level of seriousness as the Holocaust itself. There is a third reason, Reb Metzger writes, as to why we should not establish a fast day marking the destruction of the settlements in the Gush. He writes, take a look at this midrash. This midrash is commenting on a verse in the book of, it's a book in Devarim, that talks about excessive mourning practices, cutting yourself when you are in a state of mourning. So this midrash here is the Sifri. This is the Sifri. The Sifri is a halachic midrash. And this is what it says. And this is actually also repeated in several places in the Talmud as well. I believe it's found in, I think it's found in Yevamos in one place. There are several other places also. But anyways, this is what it says, Lo siskodu, don't scratch yourself. Well, the word Lo siskodu has another meaning also. And this is what the midrash pounces upon. Lo sasu agudos. Not only don't lacerate yourself, do not form opposing factions. Agudos. Ella, rather, heyu kulachem aguda achas. You should all consider yourself as part of one whole. You have to consider ourselves as one whole. We may not divide ourselves. Rav Metzger writes that if we were to mark a day, if we were to establish a day to mourn for Gush Katif, we would be magnifying this dissent that existed within the Jewish state at the time. This was a highly controversial move made by the Israeli government. This was very, very traumatic to the Jewish people, I mean, especially the people who live there, but this was a very contentious issue. To make a day like this would be to commemorate and highlight this division within the Jewish people for an eternity. And that's just not something we ought to do. So Rav Metzger gives 3 reasons as to why, when the Jewish people of the Gush were expelled from their land, why we should not mark this as a day of mourning with fasting and elegies, with kinos. A, he says that the Tisha B'Av already covers it. 2, he says we have no historical precedent. In fact, we see a historical precedent to not add fast days. And finally, if we were to create this day, then we would be commemorating division within the Jewish people forever. And that is just not something one ought to do. So he says, if you ever find yourself on the highway and you're driving by and you've seen the ruined homes of Gush Katif, there is a bracha that you recite. You say the bracha of Dayan Ha'emet, which the Gemara says you recite when you see Jewish homes in ruin. But we may not commemorate the day, or we should not commemorate the day with fasting and eulogies and elegies with kinos. Instead, as Rav Soloveitchik writes, Tisha B'Av is a day that incorporates all Jewish tragedy that we've experienced over the past 2,000 years. And perhaps we can write our own elegies for that day, or we can interpret the elegies that already exist, grant them new meaning, but to establish and mark the destruction of the Gush on Tisha B'Av, but to establish a separate special day would be wrong and perhaps forbidden as well. So here we see that we should not mark Jewish expulsion with mourning, and at the same time, according even to religious Zionist rabbinical, within the religious Zionist rabbinic framework, expelling non-Jews from the land of Israel is likewise forbidden. And with that, I'm going to stop the recording, and I'll be open for questions, comments, or rebuttals. And